The afternoon was quiet, heavy with that muted rhythm business hotels have during midweek. I arrived early, as I usually did. Habit had taught me that arriving before everyone else created a small pocket of calm before the day's noise began. The lobby smelled faintly of espresso and disinfectant, the kind of mix that only exists in places where people come and go too often to belong. I sat down near the tall windows overlooking the parking lot. The city outside looked washed out in the winter light, cars, gray buildings, an overcast sky pressed low. I opened my laptop, glanced through a few presentation slides, and tried to focus on the upcoming client meeting. The minutes stretched quietly. Nothing about that afternoon seemed unusual until I noticed her. A movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention, a woman taking off her red coat near the lounge chairs. The color stood out sharply against the beige and gold interior. It was a coat I'd seen before, years ago, when my best friend's wife wore it to a dinner party. I looked again, almost unwilling to believe what I saw. It was Emily. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps she was there for a meeting, perhaps Alex was upstairs, perhaps there was some innocent reason. But the man who joined her was not Alex. He was taller, with the casual assurance of someone who knew he was being admired. They sat close, almost touching. She laughed in a way that didn't belong to polite conversation. And then, as if to erase all doubt, she leaned in and kissed him. The world seemed to narrow to that moment. The sound of the espresso machine, the quiet hum of voices, the shifting of air conditioning, all faded. I remember watching them as though I were outside my own body. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it was disbelief mixed with dread. I'd known Alex since we were children. We grew up on the same street, played in the same dust, fought over the same things kids fight over, then went to the same college. When he married Emily, I stood beside him as his best man. I gave a speech that ended with the words, "She's lucky to have someone like you." For years afterward, I believed it. I believed she'd softened him, grounded him. Seeing her there, her hand resting on another man's arm, destroyed that illusion in a second. My instinct was to leave, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But the moment felt too deliberate to ignore. I thought about how Alex trusted people, how he always assumed the best in everyone. I knew that if I told him I'd seen her, he would ask for proof. Without it, my words could sound like gossip. I stayed. Minutes turned into an hour. My client postponed the meeting, which gave me more reason not to move. I ordered coffee, trying to act casual while my stomach twisted. Eventually, they stood up. She fixed her hair, and they walked together toward the elevators. I saw them disappear inside. 2 more hours passed before they returned. I wasn't sure why I was still there. Maybe it was the need to confirm what I'd already known. When they walked back through the lobby, she was smiling, relaxed, her arm hooked around his. There was a small mark on her neck, faint, but visible under the warm lighting. That was when I took the photos. Not many, just enough to capture them walking together, her hand on his chest, their faces close enough to leave no room for interpretation. My hands were steady. My conscience wasn't. Driving home later, I felt sick. The road lights blurred past the windshield, but my mind stayed fixed on what I'd seen. Every mile deepened the same question, should I tell Alex? I replayed our years together, how he'd helped me when my father died, how we'd shared cheap apartments and late-night talks about the future. I couldn't imagine staying silent. Silence would be easier, but it would also make me complicit. By the time I reached his neighborhood, I had made my decision. The sky was already dark, and the streetlights glowed through a light drizzle. I parked outside his house but didn't go in. Instead, I waited, engine off, staring at the front door. I thought about the risk, how a single truth could destroy everything built over decades. Yet pretending not to know would destroy something in me instead. I sat there until my hands stopped trembling, then stepped out into the cold. That night became the border between before and after. The bar was one of those places that had never changed, same dim lighting, same music that never quite reached the speakers evenly, same faces that blurred into habit. It had been our spot since college, a quiet corner of familiarity that had seen us through both heartbreak and celebration. Walking in that night felt almost symbolic. The last time we'd sat there, we were laughing about our jobs and complaining about mortgages. Now, something irreversible hung between us, unspoken but heavy. Alex was already there, seated in our usual booth. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but as though the air around him had collapsed inward. His shoulders sagged under the kind of silence that doesn't need words. His phone lay face down on the table, a glass beside it nearly empty. He was the sort of man who didn't show pain easily, which made its presence all the more obvious. We didn't talk about what I had shown him earlier. There wasn't anything left to explain. The photos had already said everything. The betrayal didn't need interpretation or analysis, it was plain, absolute. The only question remaining was what he was going to do with it. I ordered something mild and watched him stare through the glass toward nothing. The smell of alcohol mixed with the faint scent of cigarette smoke that clung to the walls. The television above the bar played muted sports highlights. People came and went around us, none aware that the quiet man in the corner had just watched his world come apart. Every few minutes, he would unlock his phone and glance at the screen, then set it down again. I didn't need to see it to know what he was looking at. There's a certain rhythm to disbelief, the desperate need to verify what has already been proven. I recognized that rhythm because I'd lived it once myself, years earlier in a different context, when someone I trusted had broken it in a way that left no chance for repair. Sitting across from him, I realized that betrayal doesn't just happen between lovers. It spills outward, touching everyone who stands too close. Alex had always been the better of us. The patient one, the optimist, the man who believed people were good until they proved otherwise. He was steady, the kind of person others leaned on. That was what made the moment so cruel. For someone like him, realizing that the foundation was built on deceit was not just painful, it was disorienting. It rewrote everything he thought he knew about his life. He kept drinking. I didn't stop him. Sometimes people need to fall apart without intervention. The weight of what he felt couldn't be shared, it had to be carried until it broke or reshaped him. At one point, his expression softened into something almost empty, that numb state that sits between rage and resignation. I'd seen it in others before, but it hit differently when it was Alex. I could almost feel the thought forming inside him, that if he forgave her, maybe life could continue as before. Maybe pretending would hurt less than beginning again. I didn't judge him for it, even though I knew it was coming. People think betrayal brings clarity, but in truth, it clouds everything. Love makes fools of those who need certainty the most. He drank until his words slurred slightly, though he still refused to acknowledge what had happened directly. I didn't push him to. The quiet between us said enough. When it grew late, I told him I'd drive him home. He didn't argue. The ride back was silent. The streets were mostly empty, washed in the pale orange of streetlights. I remember glancing at his reflection in the window. He wasn't crying, but something about his stillness was worse. There was no anger, only disbelief hollowing him out from the inside. At his house, the lights were on. I saw a shadow move past the window, hers, maybe. He stepped out slowly, paused beside the car for a moment, and then walked toward the front door. He didn't look back. I stayed parked for a minute longer, staring at the house, half expecting to see an argument unfold, the kind of storm that ends things cleanly. Nothing happened. The night remained still, indifferent. Eventually, I drove away. For the next few days, I tried not to think about it. Work filled the hours easily enough, and being away on a business trip helped. I told myself that when I returned, I'd check in on him, see how he was holding up. That was the plan, simple, rational. But plans don't hold up against silence. During that week, I didn't hear from him at all. No messages, no calls. It wasn't like him, but I didn't want to intrude. I imagined he was processing things privately, the way some men do when they can't yet face the sympathy of others. I convinced myself that space was the kindest thing I could offer. Still, every night, I thought of the photos. They were saved on my phone, untouched, yet heavy in their existence. I never deleted them, though I couldn't bring myself to look again. Proof had done its job. What remained was the slow ache of aftermath. By the time my flight home landed a week later, I already sensed that something was off. The silence had stretched too long. I drove straight to his house from the airport, ignoring fatigue. The neighborhood looked the same, calm, ordinary, unmoved by private disasters. I parked in the same spot as before and walked up to the door. Emily answered. Her face carried that polite stillness people wear when they're expecting confrontation. She looked directly at me, her expression unreadable. She said Alex wasn't home. There was no invitation to wait, no trace of discomfort or guilt. Only indifference, which somehow felt worse. I left without pressing further. Later that evening, I called him. It took a while before he picked up. His tone was calm, detached, as though everything that had happened had been quietly folded away. He said things were fine, that he'd decided to move on, that forgiveness was part of love. It took me a few seconds to understand. He had forgiven her. The call ended without resolution. I sat there afterward, listening to the static silence of my apartment, realizing that something had shifted permanently. What I thought was loyalty had turned into interference in his eyes. What I meant as help had become a wound he wanted to forget. The truth had done what betrayal couldn't, it began to separate us. After that call, our friendship began to thin out, almost invisibly at first. There was no argument, no clear moment of separation, just a quiet fading, the kind that feels like fog seeping into familiar places until everything looks different. I tried to tell myself that his decision to forgive her was his own path, not a reflection of anything between us. But something had broken beneath the surface. Every word we exchanged afterward carried the weight of unspoken resentment. It wasn't hostility. It was distance. Alex stopped initiating contact. When I reached out, he answered politely, but the warmth was gone. The conversations were brief, mechanical, filled with excuses about work or tiredness. The man who once shared every trivial detail of his life now kept everything sealed behind a wall of formality. I knew that wall wasn't built overnight. She was behind it. Emily had always possessed a kind of quiet sharpness, the ability to say something harmless that still managed to cut. Even before this, I'd sensed that she didn't like how close Alex and I were. She never said it outright, but her body language gave it away. A subtle pause when I entered a room, a polite but forced smile, a tendency to interrupt when he and I started reminiscing. After the hotel incident, she no longer needed to hide her dislike. It became strategic. At first, she played the part of the remorseful wife, apologetic, humble, devoted to repairing their marriage. She knew what people expected of her, and she performed it perfectly. But behind that performance, she was rewriting the narrative. Mutual friends began to behave differently around me. Small things, the shift in tone when they mentioned Alex, the awkward hesitation when I joined conversations. It didn't take long to piece together what was being said. Emily had found a way to recast herself as the victim of interference. In her version, I had overstepped. I had always been too involved in Alex's life, too judgmental, too suspicious. She never accused me directly, but the insinuations were enough. To most people, appearances mattered more than truth. And Emily knew how to look sincere. She told people that I'd misunderstood what I saw. That the man in the hotel was an old friend, that the kiss was a mistake, that it meant nothing. To anyone who asked why I'd take photos, she suggested that I had been waiting for her to fail. It was a lie built with precision, not loud enough to confront, but subtle enough to poison. I didn't try to defend myself. Denying it would have only fueled curiosity. Instead, I withdrew. I stopped attending gatherings where I knew they'd be. I focused on work, kept to myself, and let the silence speak in my place. It didn't help. Alex stopped replying to messages altogether. I told myself it was temporary, that time might allow reason to resurface. But months passed, and the gap only widened. He began posting pictures of their trips, dinners, new routines, fragments of a reconstructed life that looked strangely curated, as if meant to convince himself that forgiveness had worked. I wondered if he ever thought of the night at the bar. If he still remembered the photos. I sometimes imagined him looking at her across the table and choosing to believe she had changed, because the alternative would mean rebuilding his entire identity. He wasn't weak. He was tired. People often think betrayal is one act, one moment of discovery. But in reality, it's a process that continues quietly afterward. It lingers in how people look at you, how they reinterpret your motives, how truth becomes distorted into something inconvenient. For me, it meant carrying the knowledge of what I'd seen without the right to speak about it anymore. I became an intruder in a story I hadn't written. A few months later, I ran into them at a friend's birthday dinner. I hadn't planned to attend, but I'd arrived early, and by the time they walked in, leaving would have looked deliberate. Emily was dressed elegantly, the red coat replaced by something muted, controlled. Alex followed her closely, the way people do when they're guarding something fragile. She greeted everyone warmly, then turned to me with practiced civility. There was no sign of guilt or unease, only confidence. To anyone watching, we might have seemed like old friends exchanging polite smiles. But her eyes carried something colder. It wasn't hostility. It was ownership. Throughout the evening, she made sure to dominate every conversation. She laughed louder, drew Alex into her orbit, and left no space for him to look elsewhere. It was a subtle display of control, one meant not just for me, but for everyone present. She had rewritten their marriage into a public performance of reconciliation, and I was an unwanted character in the script. When the evening ended, I walked out without saying goodbye. That was the moment I realized that the friendship we'd had no longer existed. It hadn't died suddenly, it had been smothered slowly, deliberately. In the following years, the silence between us hardened into something permanent. Birthdays, holidays, messages, all disappeared. If we crossed paths through mutual acquaintances, it was always through third-hand mentions. They're doing fine, they bought a new place, they had a child. Every time I heard something new, the image of that day in the hotel lobby flickered back into focus. It was no longer sharp, time had blurred its edges. But it remained the anchor point, the moment that divided everything into before and after. I often wondered what Alex believed deep down. Whether he truly thought I'd acted out of malice, or whether he simply found it easier to distance himself from the truth by distancing himself from me. Either way, the result was the same. Friendship, I learned, isn't destroyed by betrayal itself, but by what comes after, by the silence that replaces trust, by the stories people tell to protect themselves from pain. And in that silence, I had become a stranger to the person I once called my brother. Years went by quietly, though the memory never really faded. I moved apartments, changed jobs, and adjusted to the kind of adulthood where most days pass without event. Yet every so often, something, a hotel lobby, a red coat in a crowd, the echo of laughter, brought that afternoon back like a faint scar under the surface. Time has a strange way of softening certain things and hardening others. The pain dulled, but the disappointment remained. Not in Emily, she had simply revealed who she always was. The disappointment rested in Alex, in how he chose illusion over honesty. For a long while, I tried to understand it. I told myself that maybe forgiveness had truly healed them, that perhaps I had been too rigid in my judgment. But deep down, I knew what had happened. He hadn't forgiven her because he believed in her. He had forgiven her because he couldn't bear to start over. That realization shifted something in me. I began to see how people often live by protecting the stories that allow them to function. Truth, when it threatens those stories, becomes the enemy. And those who speak it, even with the best intentions, become collateral damage. I learned to live with silence. At first, it was heavy, filled with the urge to explain, to defend myself, to remind him of what friendship had once meant. But explanations are wasted when people have already chosen what they want to believe. Over time, the urge faded. I stopped checking his social media, stopped asking mutual friends about him. I erased his contact from my phone, not out of anger, but because I no longer knew who I'd be calling. Years later, during a conference at another hotel, I saw them again. It was almost poetic, the same setting, the same faint smell of coffee and carpet polish. They stood at the reception desk, checking in. Alex carried a suitcase in each hand, she stood beside him, scrolling on her phone. From a distance, they looked like any other couple passing through the transience of travel. He had aged in the way quiet suffering ages a person, not dramatically, but in small, weary details. His posture was slightly stooped, his expression neutral. Emily looked largely unchanged, though her eyes held the faint sharpness of someone who has spent years ensuring control. They didn't notice me at first. I was sitting by the window, half hidden behind a potted plant, watching the rhythm of people coming and going. I could have looked away, but I didn't. I studied them, not out of bitterness, but curiosity. I wondered whether either of them ever thought about that day, whether the photos still existed somewhere in a forgotten folder or whether they had been deleted the moment denial became more comfortable than truth. Then she saw me. It was only for a moment, a flicker of recognition. Her expression didn't change, but something tightened in her eyes. She turned slightly toward Alex, said something brief, and guided him toward the elevator. He didn't look back. I waited until the elevator doors closed before standing up. There was no satisfaction in seeing them. Only a quiet confirmation that time had closed the distance completely. Walking out of that hotel felt like walking out of a long shadow. The air outside was cold, clean. The city had changed, new buildings, brighter signs, faster lives. For the first time, I felt detached not from them, but from the version of myself who had once carried their secrets like a burden. People often talk about closure as if it's an event, a conversation, a moment of understanding. In truth, closure is simply the point where you stop needing to be understood. It's when the questions stop mattering, when you can accept that some chapters end without apology or resolution. Over the years, I have come to see that honesty and peace rarely coexist. Telling the truth may align with integrity, but it rarely leaves anyone happier. It exposes, rearranges, and sometimes destroys. I told the truth once, and it cost me the one friendship I thought would outlast everything. Yet even knowing the outcome, I would still do it again. Because silence, for me, would have been a kind of betrayal too. There are nights when I still think about the time before all of this, the simplicity of it. We were younger then, convinced that loyalty was unbreakable. I remember the way we'd make plans for the future, the way he used to laugh without restraint. That version of us doesn't exist anymore, but it was real once, and that's enough. The last thing I remember of Alex is a brief moment years ago, long after the hotel encounter. I was walking through a park on a Sunday morning when I saw him from afar, pushing a stroller. He was talking to someone on the phone, smiling faintly. It was a quiet, ordinary happiness. I could have approached him, but I didn't. Some distances, once created, aren't meant to be crossed again. I watched him for a moment, then turned and walked away. As I left the park, the sun was filtering through the trees, scattering light across the path. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace that wasn't rooted in justification. I didn't need him to understand my side, and I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Truth had taken its toll, but it had also freed me from the weight of pretending. That's what people rarely admit, that sometimes the price of doing the right thing is solitude, and that solitude, over time, becomes its own kind of clarity. Looking back now, I realize that telling him about Emily wasn't about morality or righteousness. It was about respect, the belief that a person deserves to know when their life is being built on a lie. What he did with that truth was never mine to control. In the end, we each chose our own form of peace. His came through denial, mine through acceptance. The friendship we had belonged to a time when honesty seemed simple. Life taught me otherwise. And yet, even after everything, I still hope he found happiness, whatever shape it took, whatever truth it required him to ignore. Because despite everything that was lost, he remains part of the story that shaped who I became. The story ends where it began, in a lobby filled with strangers, the quiet hum of life moving forward, and me, sitting still, understanding at last that not every truth is meant to save. Some are only meant to set you free.